If you're watching this and you have an elderly parent living in your home, I need you to stay with me until the end, because what I'm about to tell you is something I never, in 67 years of living, believed could happen inside my own walls. My name is Lorne Castleberry. I'm 67 years old. I spent 32 years working as a land surveyor for the province of Ontario, retired 4 years ago, and had been living quietly in the same two-story house in Barrie that my wife and I bought back in 1989. We raised 2 children here. We painted every room in this house at least twice. We buried a dog in the backyard and cried about it for a week. This is the house where my life happened. And this is the house where something I will never fully understand also happened, quietly in the dark while I was asleep 20 feet away. This story is about my father. And about my daughter-in-law. My father, who I'll call Dad because that's who he is and that's all he'll ever be to me, is 83 years old. He was born in Timmins, the son of a Finnish immigrant who worked in the mines. He worked hard his whole life, first as a mechanic, then running his own small repair shop in Sudbury for 30 years. He's the kind of man who never asked anyone for anything, never complained. When my mother died 11 years ago, he grieved quietly and then got on with things. That was his way. About 3 years ago, things started to slip. Small things at first. He'd forget where he put his reading glasses. He'd call me by my uncle's name, his brother who passed in 2009. Once he left the water running in the bathroom of his apartment for an entire afternoon and flooded the unit below him. His doctor said it was early-stage cognitive decline, probably vascular dementia. Not the kind that takes everything at once, but the slow, creeping kind. He was still himself, mostly. Still laughed at hockey night in Canada. Still had opinions about everything. But he couldn't be alone anymore. My brother lives in Calgary. We talked on the phone. We both knew what needed to happen. I had the house. I was retired. My wife and I had the space since our youngest had moved out 2 years earlier. I told my brother I'd take Dad in. He offered to contribute financially toward Dad's care, and he has kept that promise. $500 a month into an account I use for anything Dad needs. That part was never the problem. My wife had reservations. I understood them. She was honest with me, and I appreciated that. She said she was willing to try, but that she needed me to understand her limits. She had her own life, her book club, her volunteering at the library on Thursdays, her sister in Collingwood she visited every month or two. She wasn't willing to become a full-time caregiver. That was fair. I told her I'd handle the day-to-day, and I meant it. Dad moved in with us in the spring just after Easter. We converted the main floor bedroom for him, the one off the hallway near the bathroom. We brought his recliner, his television, his coffee mug with the Sudbury Wolves logo that he's had since 1994. He seemed cautiously happy. A little overwhelmed at first, the way you are when your world gets smaller. But he settled in. He and I would sit at the kitchen table after breakfast and do the crossword from the Globe and Mail, though he'd often lose the thread halfway through, and we'd end up talking about something else entirely, which was fine. Better sometimes. My son and his wife lived about 20 minutes away in Innisfil. They came for dinner most Sundays. My son, I had no worries about. He's always been close to his grandfather. As a kid, he used to spend whole summers at Dad's shop, handing him tools and learning the names of things. But his wife was newer to all of us. They'd been together 5 years, married for 2. She was pleasant enough, organized, efficient. Not a warm person exactly, but I didn't think anything of it. Not everyone is warm. That doesn't make them cruel. It started slowly, the way these things always do. By the end of June, Dad seemed different. He was quieter. He slept longer in the mornings, sometimes past 10, which wasn't like him. He'd always been up by 7 his whole life. He started leaving more food on his plate. He'd never been a big eater, but he'd always finished what was in front of him. Now he'd push things around and say he wasn't hungry. He was losing weight. Not dramatically, but I could see it in his face, the way his collar sat loose on his neck. And he startled easily. That was the thing I noticed most. If someone came into the room without him hearing them first, he'd flinch. His shoulders would come up and his hands would grip the arms of his chair. My father. A man who'd rebuilt engines and never once seemed rattled by anything. One Sunday evening in late July, my son and his wife had come for dinner. It was a warm night and we'd eaten on the back deck. Dad had been quiet through most of the meal, which wasn't unusual. After my son went inside to help my wife with dessert, his wife stayed at the table with Dad and me. I excused myself to grab another chair cushion from the shed. I was gone maybe 3 minutes. When I came back, Dad had gone inside. His wife was checking her phone. I didn't think much of it. But later that night, when I helped Dad get ready for bed, he said something that stopped me. "She doesn't like me, Lorne." I sat down on the edge of his bed. "What do you mean? Who?" He nodded vaguely in the direction of nowhere in particular. "Her. She told me I shouldn't have moved in here." I kept my voice even. "Dad, when did she say that?" "Outside. Tonight, when you went to get the chair." He looked at his hands. "She said your wife is tired, said I'm making things hard for everyone." I didn't know what to say. I wanted to tell him he'd misunderstood, that maybe he'd gotten confused. But the look on his face wasn't the look of a confused man. It was the look of a man who'd been told something unkind and had been sitting with it for 3 hours. I told him it wasn't true. I told him he was welcome here, that this was his home too. He nodded and said, "Okay," but he turned toward the wall when I said goodnight. He didn't look convinced. I didn't say anything to my son that night. I told myself it might have been a misunderstanding. I told myself Dad sometimes mixed things up, heard things that weren't said, or remembered them differently than they happened. I had no proof of anything, and I didn't want to drive a wedge in my son's marriage over what might have been nothing. But I started paying attention. Over the next few weeks, I noticed things I'd been explaining away. The way Dad would go very still if my daughter-in-law was in the room. The way he'd stop talking mid-sentence and look down at the table if she walked through. She was over more often than usual that summer because her office had given her work-from-home days, and she'd sometimes come to our place to use the quiet guest room upstairs while my son was at work. She said she concentrated better there. I noticed that on the days she was in the house, Dad barely left his room. I told myself I was reading into things. My wife thought I was being overprotective. "You hover over him, Lorne," she told me gently one evening. "He's not a child. He probably just wants some quiet." She wasn't wrong that I worried. But this felt different from worry. Then in August I found the bruise. I was helping Dad with his shower, which I did twice a week since he'd become unsteady on his feet. I was handing him a towel when I saw it on his upper arm, on the inside, where the skin is soft. It was dark, yellowish at the edges the way bruises get when they're a few days old. Not one bruise, 3, clustered together like fingerprints. Dad. I kept my voice calm, but my chest had gone tight. "What happened to your arm?" He looked at it. "I don't know. I bumped into something." "When?" "I don't remember." He pulled the towel around himself and looked away. I pressed gently. "Did you fall? Did you hit the bed frame?" I said, "I don't know, Lorne." His voice had gone flat. He didn't want to talk about it. And that, more than the bruises, is what frightened me. My father is not a man who goes flat. He's a man who has a story for everything. Even when he repeats himself, he repeats with enthusiasm. A man who says, "I don't know," and looks away, is a man who knows exactly and doesn't want to say. I made him comfortable, helped him into his chair with his tea, and then I sat in the kitchen for a long time thinking. I thought about the bruises. I thought about what he'd told me in July. I thought about the days he wouldn't leave his room. I thought about the nights. This was the part I kept circling back to. Dad's bad days were always worse in the morning. He'd be more tired, more withdrawn. It was as if something was depleting him while I slept. I'd started sleeping more deeply than I used to, which my doctor had attributed to my blood pressure medication adjusted last spring. I was out by 11 most nights and didn't stir until 6. I spent 2 days arguing with myself about what I was considering. It felt like an accusation, like I was pointing a finger at someone based on nothing solid. But the bruises were solid. The fear was solid. The change in my father was solid. I drove to a Canadian Tire in Barrie and bought a small security camera, the kind you can set up for indoor monitoring. The young man at the counter showed me the basics. It had night vision, motion activation, and stored footage on a small memory card. It cost me $180. I paid cash. I set it up on a Thursday afternoon while Dad was napping and my daughter-in-law had gone home for the day. I placed it on his bookshelf, tucked behind a framed photograph of him and my mother from their 40th anniversary trip to Cape Breton. The lens was barely visible. I adjusted the angle until it covered his bed and the door clearly. I told myself I'd give it 3 nights. The first night, nothing happened. I checked the footage in the morning, and it showed only Dad sleeping, getting up once around 2 to use the bathroom, going back to bed. Normal. I felt foolish for a few hours. The second night, I almost didn't check. But I did. She appeared at 12:43 in the morning. I know the exact time because it's burned into me now. She opened his door slowly, like someone who had done it before and knew exactly which angle kept the hinges quiet. She was in the dark hallway, and then she was in his room, and she stood at the foot of his bed looking at him. She didn't turn on the light. She shook his shoulder. Not gently. Dad woke up confused, the way he always does when he wakes in the night, disoriented and slow. He tried to sit up. She pushed him back down with one hand on his chest. I couldn't hear everything. The audio on that camera wasn't strong, but I could see his face. I watched that footage more times than I can count, and his face is never going to leave me. He looked like a man who'd been expecting this, like he knew she was coming and had been lying there waiting for it. She leaned down close to him and spoke for several minutes. I caught fragments. Burden. Wearing everyone out. Should be in a home where people are paid to deal with you. I caught my own name. She used it in a way that made clear to Dad that I didn't feel what he thought I felt, that my patience was running thin, that I was only keeping him here because I felt obligated. None of that was true, not one word. Then she grabbed his arm, the inside of the upper arm, exactly where the bruises were. She gripped it and leaned in close and said something directly into his ear. He nodded. He just nodded, the way a small child nods when they've been told to stop crying in public. She let go. She stood up straight. She smoothed her top down with both hands, the way you smooth yourself after nothing happened, and she walked out. On the screen, my father lay still for a long time. Then he turned onto his side, facing the wall, and I could see his shoulders moving. He was crying. I sat at my kitchen table with that footage on my laptop, and I didn't move, for I don't know how long. My coffee went cold. Outside, it was getting light. The birds started up, the way they do in August mornings, and it all felt grotesque, the ordinary world just continuing. She had been coming into my house, into my father's room, in the middle of the night, and doing this to him. And he had been lying in that bed every evening, waiting for it, and not telling me. Not telling me because she'd apparently convinced him I didn't want to know, that I was on her side, that speaking up would only make things worse for him. He was 83 years old, and he was afraid in my house. I checked the previous night's footage more carefully, and found that the camera had in fact captured a partial motion event 2 nights before I reviewed it, a shadow near the door that I dismissed as nothing. Looking again, I could see it wasn't nothing. I didn't go to her. I didn't confront her that morning. I know some people will think that was wrong. But I'd lived 67 years, and I'd seen enough to know that going to someone with an accusation and no plan hands them the advantage. She would deny it. She'd be calm and reasonable, and she'd look at me with that organized, efficient face, and she'd say Dad was confused, that he'd dreamed it, that maybe I should talk to his doctor about his night behaviors. And I would be left with a damaged relationship and no resolution. I needed to do this right, for Dad's sake. I called my brother in Calgary that morning. I told him everything. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "What do you need?" "I need a few days," I said, "and then I need you to come here." I also called our family doctor's office, Dr. Pausta's. Naidu had been our physician for 18 years. I explained the situation to her receptionist and asked for an urgent appointment. We were in the next morning. Dr. Naidu examined Dad thoroughly. She was careful with him, patient, asked questions in a way that didn't feel like an interrogation. She documented 3 bruises on his upper arm and 1 I hadn't seen on his lower back. She told him gently that she needed to understand how he'd gotten them. He was evasive at first, the same way he'd been with me, but then she said, "I need you to know that anything you tell me stays between us for now. You're not going to get into trouble. I just want to make sure you're safe." And Dad, who had kept this to himself for God knows how long, started to cry. He told her about the night visits. He told her she'd said I was losing patience with him. He told her he'd been too scared to say anything because he was afraid of ending up in a facility where nobody knew him. He said he thought maybe he deserved it because he was becoming a burden. You've the room for a moment. I stood in the hallway of that medical building and put my hand flat on the wall and breathed. Dr. Naidu filed a mandatory report that afternoon. In Ontario, regulated health professionals are required to report suspected abuse of adults in certain circumstances, and she acted without hesitation. She also referred Dad to a social worker who specializes in elder abuse, a woman based out of Royal Victoria Regional Health Centre. 2 days later, my brother flew in from Calgary. We went to the police together, the 3 of us, Dad and my brother and me. The officer we spoke with at the detachment was thorough and took everything seriously. I brought the footage on a USB drive. I brought the medical report. I sat across a desk and watched a police officer watch my daughter-in-law walk into my father's room at 12:43 in the morning and put her hand on his chest and push him down. The officer looked up when it finished and said, "We'll be in touch with her today." They went to her house. She and my son were both home. I don't know exactly what was said. My son called me that evening and his voice was a sound I hope I never hear again. The sound of a person whose entire understanding of someone they love has just collapsed. He hadn't known. I'd been afraid he had in some way, and finding out he hadn't was both a relief and its own kind of grief. She was charged. Assault causing bodily harm, criminal harassment, intimidation of a person who was vulnerable by reason of age. The Crown took it seriously. My son moved out of their house that week. He stayed with a friend. He called me every day. We talked more in those weeks than we had in years. Long calls in the evening where we didn't always say much, just stayed on the line together. He was devastated and furious and guilty for not having seen it, all at once. I told him, "You don't see what you're not looking for." I told him the same thing about myself. The legal process took the better part of a year. My daughter-in-law's lawyer argued that Dad's dementia made his testimony unreliable, that the footage was ambiguous, that she'd simply been checking on him. The footage was not ambiguous. The medical evidence was not ambiguous. The Crown prosecutor, a calm and methodical man from Barrie, who reminded me a bit of my old geometry teacher, presented everything without drama, and the jury didn't need long. She was convicted. The judge sentenced her to 14 months in custody, followed by 2 years of probation with conditions that included no contact with Dad or with me and a prohibition from working in any caregiving capacity. My son filed for divorce before the sentencing. He told me he'd made his decision long before the verdict, that the marriage had been over the moment he understood what she'd done. I didn't push him on it. It was his to grieve in his own way. Dad lived with us for another 8 months after the arrest. He healed physically faster than I expected. The bruises faded. He started eating again, started sleeping through the night again. He started asking for the crossword in the mornings. Some days he was almost like himself. But the nighttime fear took longer to leave him. He'd sometimes wake in the night and call out, and I'd go to him and sit in the chair by his bed until he settled. I didn't mind. I'd rather have been there than have him lying in the dark, afraid and alone. Eventually, the dementia progressed to a point where he needed more help than I could give at home. We found a long-term care home in Barrie, a good one, with staff ratios that actually made sense, and a recreation program that Dad took to immediately, particularly Thursday afternoon bingo, which he approaches with the focused intensity he once brought to engine diagnostics. I visit him 4 times a week. Some days he knows exactly who I am and calls me by name. Other days he looks at me like I'm someone he's pretty sure he recognizes but can't quite place. I sit with him either way. My brother visits twice a year now. We're closer than we've been since childhood. Something about going through something like this with a person changes the frequency you're on together. My son is doing better. He's back in his own apartment in Innisfil. We have dinner together on Sundays, just the 2 of us now, and sometimes we drive up to visit Dad together afterward. He's working through it, the way you work through things that don't have a clean ending. I'm proud of him. I told him so directly, which is not something I was always good at. I think about the months before I set up that camera, about the things I explained away, about how many mornings I sat across the breakfast table from my father and didn't see what was right in front of me, because the alternative was too strange to consider. Margaret was my wife's term for her, my daughter-in-law, and she was a perfectly composed, competent woman who brought good wine to Sunday dinners and remembered everyone's birthdays. You don't look for cruelty in that package, but it can live there. The reason I'm sharing this is not because I want people to feel sorry for me or for my father. We're on the other side of it now. I share it because elder abuse in Canada is still deeply underreported. Statistics Canada data suggests that a significant portion of elder abuse is perpetrated by family members, and most of it never comes to anyone's attention because the person being harmed is either unable to report it, afraid to, or has been deliberately isolated from the people who might help them. If you are caring for an older person and something feels off, trust that. Not every feeling is accurate, but the particular feeling that something is being hidden from you. The way a person goes quiet when someone walks in, the bruises that don't have a clear story, the weight loss, the fear that arrives without a name. Those things are worth investigating. You can call the Seniors Safety Line in Ontario at 1-866-209-1011. It's free, confidential, and available around the clock. Every province has equivalent resources. If you are an elderly person watching this, or someone is watching it with you, I want you to hear this clearly. You are not a burden for needing care. You are not an inconvenience. You do not deserve to be afraid in your own home, whatever home that is. What is being done to you, if something is being done to you, is not your fault, and there are people who will listen. My father is safe. He's at bingo on Thursday afternoons, and he's sleeping through the night. And some days he looks at me across the table and says, "You know, Lorne, you turned out all right," which for a Finnish-Canadian man from Timmins is about as close to a declaration of love as you're going to get. It's enough. It's more than enough.